expectations are often unrealistic, or mostly always unrealistic, and that it it leads to, all kinds of problems, great frustration. And for me this last week, it led to a real test of my ability to hold on to emotional sobriety under circumstances that were very stressful, which was I got scammed, really very cleverly scammed through an Apple website for thousands of dollars. And in quiet time, I spent time thinking, okay, what was my part in this? And I guess the answer to that would be, I just trust people that when they're telling me something, it's true. But it wasn't true. So it was a real test of trying to keep myself grounded emotionally. And I sort of succeeded. I'm sad.
No, I know a little bit about your circumstances, and I'm sorry.
Thank you.
No, it's that weird thing about us wanting to trust and wanting to think, the best of people, and yet sometimes it can really set us up.
It
Uh,
certainly did.
well, I remember you just recalled an example, and I didn't get hit for thousands of dollars, but I think it was like $100. I was at a Bank of America, and I was getting some cash out or something like that, and this woman comes up to me, and she's got this badge around her neck that she's a nurse over here at Little Company of Mary Hospital, which was right around the corner. And she goes, "Oh God, I'm wondering if you could help me. I can't get into my ATM card, and I needs this and I need that, and da da." And she had this whole story about how she needed $100 and how that I could take a picture of her card and stuff at the hospital, and she would get back to me, and totally got my confidence. I mean, totally got my confidence. Gave her $100, called the hospital about 3 weeks later and never heard from her. They don't know that there was no employee at that. She had, taken and falsified an ID to make it look like it was such. And, she was hitting on people at ATMs to give them money. And it worked. She had a great story. I felt really sorry for her. I mean, my God.
Scam artists have elevated it to an art form.
Well, it's true. I mean, I've heard people, be called up, and this one fellow here in Doylestown, the person called up and said he was an FBI agent, and that if he gave him several $1,000s, he would help clear his name for these pedophile charges that were bogus. I mean, it was crazy, but he got so anxious about it, he almost gave him the money. I mean, yeah. So that's, it's how do we stay balanced with these things? See, how do we keep, you know what I mean? At least a skeptical eye, if not a healthy amount of paranoia, if you will, that is this real or not real?
I even asked him how did I know what he was saying was true, and he convinced me it was.
He did it, huh? He pulled it off. See, he was good.
Yeah.
He was good. He was good. Well, boy, this comes around. The topic tonight is forgiveness. I mean, that's the chapter we're on.
Not sure I can go there.
Yeah, how fitting it is in terms of what you're talking about. Yeah, somebody else posted in there saying somebody got scammed out of most of his savings last year, but he didn't drink. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? But let me talk about forgiveness, because we started the conversation last week, and I've heard from many people that, looking at this self-forgiveness and the importance of that, and especially looking at our relationship with our body. And I suggested to some people that in doing this work that you write and you make amends to your body for the abuse that you put it through. and then let your body respond to the amends as we do, right? Because if we go to make amends, like if we're working steps 8 and 9, when we go to somebody and we talk to them and try to make amends for what we've wronged, at some point we do say, have I missed anything, or is there anything you want to say about the experience you have? And we're open to that as part of the process, right? That's part of trying to make that person whole or to repair the situation we're in. And so several of you listen to your bodies, and some of you were really called out. You know, your body was pissed off at you in terms of what you've been doing to it, rightly so. And it's good you're finally listening to that and what's going on. And a lot of us have discovered that when we do it, it's not just that our body's upset with what we did to ourselves in the past, it's what we do to ourselves now that becomes an issue as well. So let's pay attention to that. Well, I want to build on that in some way today and take maybe a little different angle on it. I want to talk more about forgiveness. But what I want to do is I want to couch it in this term, in this context. Um, a very brilliant psychologist out of UCLA said, it is not possible for me to enjoy and encourage your full expression of yourself if I have not done that with myself. See, if we're in a relationship and I have not come to peace with all of my conflict within myself and dealing with all the should demands I have and ideas I have about how I should function, I am not going to be able to encourage you to be who you are and to express yourself and give full expression to and encourage your authenticity because of my rules about how things are supposed to be. And his insight really was a much deeper understanding of this idea. If I can't love myself, how can I really love you? And see, he took it down to that, a much deeper level of if I don't support myself in being who I am, and support myself in crying if I need to cry, shouting if I need to shout, encouraging myself to say some of the things I would never dare to say. If I'm unable to support myself in that way, how in the world can I give you that same support in our relationship? It's impossible. You just can't do it. You see, the truth of it is the golden rule is not treating other people the way we would like to be treated. We treat other people the way we treat ourselves. That's what we really do. That's what the golden rule is about. Now, that can be good news and it can be bad news, depending on the kind of relationship in the area that we're talking about in relationship with ourselves. Some areas we're really okay with ourselves. You know, in those areas, we're going to be okay with someone else. But it's those areas that we have not come to peace with yet, that we have not dealt with, that there's still unresolved feelings about. It's going to be hard then for me to give you that grace and to support you and have that compassion and empathy for you that I might otherwise like to have. Now, how does that fit in with forgiveness? Well, there's a direct correlation. If I have trouble forgiving you, you can rest assured it has its roots in my lack of forgiveness for the mistakes I've made in my life. I will say that again. If I have trouble forgiving you, it has a lot to do with not forgiving myself for the mistakes that I've made in my life. Now, as you know, we're going through 12 essential insights, and this is the insight we're talking about right now is about forgiveness. This is the insight number 10. I want to read to you the session I had with this woman because I think it's pretty powerful in terms of what happens for her. And it'll give you some insight into this whole process. I met Victoria at one of the emotional sobriety workshops I lead. Typically, I start the workshop on a Friday night with introductions to each other and to emotional sobriety. We have educational sessions during the day, and on Saturday night, we hold a very special meeting exploring emotional dependency, unenforceable rules, our emotional center of gravity, and knowing it's not personal. Personal. On Sunday morning, we adjourn. Saturday evening is a special session because it is devoted to personal work. On this particular weekend, there were 28 people attending the workshop. We arranged the chairs in a semicircle and left a space in the front of the circle for me to meet with volunteers who wanted to work on their emotional sobriety. Signups are done on Saturday afternoon, and Victoria was the first on the list. She eagerly joined me in front of the group. Victoria started the session by telling me, quote, even though I have been in recovery for 3 years, my emotions are frozen, quote, unquote. Well, I asked her, what did you mean by that? What do you mean by your emotions are frozen? This is what she said. 10 years ago, I was driving a Ford Pinto. You guys remember those Ford Pintos, right? My husband was in the passenger seat, and my 3-year-old daughter was in the back in a child's car seat. We were stopped at a traffic light when a drunk driver in a truck slammed into the rear of our car going about 45 miles an hour. Our car instantly burst into flames. Now, a few of you may recall that the Pintos had a design flaw, terrible design flaw. If there was a collision in the back of the car, the gas tank ignited. So it was like driving a napalm bomb that was ready to go off if you got hit. Their gas tanks would often catch on fire when they were struck from behind. She goes on to say, and this is terrible. I mean, if you put yourself in her shoes, you can feel the anguish and pain. She goes, my 3-year-old daughter burned to death in the back of the seat. I mean, what's that like? You're sitting in front and you're helpless to reach your daughter who's burning to death in the back seat. My husband had burns over 3/4 of his body. He's been in physical and emotional pain ever since the accident. He can only walk with a cane. I didn't have a scratch on me, but a part of me wishes I died that afternoon too with my daughter. Well, you guys can feel it, right? You can imagine what the mood in the room was like. It was darkening as Victoria told her story. Even though she didn't answer my question directly, her delivery of this horrific experience demonstrated what she meant when she stated she was frozen. Her voice and her affect were flat. There was no feeling at all as she described what had to be a terrible, terrible event and a traumatic event in her life. Her voice and her affect were flat, as though she were in front of an 8th-grade class reading an excerpt from a local newspaper. It was obvious that she was emotionally shut down and disconnected or dissociated from her feelings. See, oftentimes we dissociate when we can't handle the experience that we're having. It's almost like a circuit breaker, you can think of it. You know how it goes off when there's too much of a charge going through the line, and then the breaker goes off and just cuts off the electricity. Well, that's what happens when we dissociate. I imagine she had no choice but to shut herself down. It's like we possess an emotional fuse that shorts out when we experience or witness an event that overwhelms our psyche. I told Victoria that I now understood what she meant when she told me she was frozen. She responded, I know it's bad for me to not feel my feelings about what happened, but I don't know how to do it. Can you help me, Dr. Berger? I told her, yes, there is a way. We get unfrozen when we speak the words that most accurately reflect our experience. I want you guys to hear that. That when you discover the words that most accurately reflect your experience and find the courage to say them, is when you really get in touch with what's going on with you. When we find the right words, our emotions will flow freely. See, there's been a veer in psychology. We say, what are you feeling? Instead of help that person find the words that will connect them to their feelings. We've kind of put the cart before the horse a lot of times. I then explained the protocol for the empty chair work I wanted to do with her. She consented. You guys know the protocol is that you use an empty chair to represent either a part of yourself or some person that you have some unfinished business with, and it gives you a chance to try to deal with and finish that business. So she consented to trying this exercise during the workshop. Very brave. Her unbearable pain no doubt pushed her to confront her past in front of the group. Took a lot of courage, obviously, right, for her to face this. The first encounter I asked Victoria to have was to talk to the drunk driver who killed her daughter and injured her husband. Do you know his name? I asked. Yes, she said. It's Chad. I said, okay, let's put Chad in this empty chair in front of you and see what surfaces for you. Just put him there and see what you start to feel when you imagine Chad sitting in front of you. Now, can you imagine how powerful that would be? Just to be in the room with that person that you're sitting with? Victoria looked at me and said, I don't know what to say to him. I told her, say that to Chad. Tell him that you don't know what to say to him. Turning to the imaginary Chad and telling him that she didn't know what to say seemed to unlock a sealed chamber for Victoria. I don't know, she said. If there are words to tell you how much I hate you and what you have done to our family, you killed my little girl, she screamed. You killed my little girl. Her tears welled up, but she continued. She burned to death in the back seat of the car, and there was nothing I could do to save her. I don't get to hold her in my arms anymore. I don't get to brush her beautiful brown hair. I don't get to dress her in the morning. Victoria stopped to wipe her tears, but this only seemed to make room for more. She began sobbing, and her cries of sadness gradually turned into shouts of rage. I don't get to hear her call out my name. I don't get to see her reach for me with her tiny arms. I don't get to hold her as she looks to me for comfort. You killed her, you motherfucker. You had no right to be drinking and driving. You were reckless. You crippled my husband too. You took so much from my life. I will never forgive you. Victoria dropped her head. She cried and cried and cried. Victoria touched the entire group. At least half were in tears. I invited those group participants to share what they were experiencing. Several who were in recovery for their alcoholism or addiction related to how guilty they felt for driving under the influence. There I sit in Chad's chair, but for the grace of God, one member of the group said. That could have been me. When Victoria had recuperated enough, I asked her to have a conversation with her daughter. Things got much heavier. God, I'm feeling this as I read it to you guys. I'm reliving the whole session. Crying heavily, she told her daughter how much she missed her. She talked about how painful it was not to be able to pull her out of the burning car. She told her daughter that her screams from the back seat still pierced her heart whenever she closed her eyes. Each of these statements were accompanied by tears and deep, deep cries of pain. No longer frozen, Victoria was alive again. She was grieving her daughter's death and reliving the trauma of that experience, fully reliving the trauma of that experience. She was feeling resentful and angry towards Chad, but these emotions were beginning to transform as we talked. She was beginning to finish some unfinished business. When we interfere with experience and what we need to feel, we create unfinished business. This interrupts an instinct that moves us towards completion, resolution, and wholeness. Dr. Nathaniel Branden understood this process well when he wrote, "The emotions that are most frequently repressed are pain, rage, and fear. Healthy growth, development, and change are thereby prevented from taking place or significant by taking, I'm sorry, are thereby prevented from taking place or significantly obstructed. A person who does not permit himself to know what hurts him cannot permit himself to know what he wants, cannot permit himself to know and experience the importance of the desires and needs that are frustrated, and therefore cannot take effective steps towards their fulfillment. Healthy change necessarily begins with self-awareness, which in turn requires an attitude of self-acceptance. When we cut ourselves off from what we are feeling, we cut ourselves off from our potential. We cut ourselves off from our humanity. We cut ourselves off from peace. Victoria was recovering her humanity in the group on that Saturday night. But as you will soon find out, she was also able to liberate herself from resentment and anger she felt towards Chad and herself too. This is the real significance of forgiveness. Later, we tuned back into the group to take a deeper look at how Victoria forgave herself from the man whose decision had so terribly altered her life. All right. So let us go to the next part of Victoria's work. Okay. Victoria had worked hard in the group during the weekend workshop. Using the chair exercises, she confronted Chad about killing her daughter and maiming her husband. She had grieved and made her poignant goodbyes to her daughter, but I sensed there was more work to be done. Victoria seemed ready to take the next step in the direction of forgiveness. It was late Saturday, but we forged ahead. I asked Victoria if she'd be willing to continue to work with me to see if she could find an even more peace of mind. She agreed. I asked her to put her own alcoholism in the empty chair. I think you have a lot to say to that part of you, I suggested. She agreed. This turned out to be a very important step in Victoria's journey toward forgiving Chad. She started out being very harsh toward her alcoholism. We were already in crisis, and then you came along and made the situation worse. You told me that the only way I could get through the death of my daughter was to drink my way through it, she said. That was bullshit. It didn't help me grieve my daughter's death. It didn't resolve anything. And what made matters worse is I abandoned my husband because of you. He really needed me, and I was rarely there for him. I even drank and drove. Listen to that, you guys. I even drank and drove. Do you believe that? I drove drunk, full knowing what I might do to someone. That was insanity. Victoria had a lot to say during the interaction with her alcoholism. What stood out to me was that she was stuck blaming her alcoholism for all her trouble, which meant she wasn't taking responsibility for listening to that part of herself. I made a mental note that this might need to be addressed. Okay, I said after she finished speaking to her alcoholism, now change and be your alcoholism and respond to Victoria, right? So she changed chairs, right? You see what she did? She went to the other chair. When she became her alcoholism, she was quite matter of fact. You are blaming me for your drinking, but you picked up the bottle. All I did was tell you to drink. You picked up the bottle. You chose to drink because you needed to, but you blame everyone for what you do. You even blamed your husband for your drinking, yelling at him that he was not supportive enough, and that's why you drank. You're disgusting. Quit being a victim, she instructed. You wanted to check out because you couldn't deal with losing your daughter. Don't blame me. Now you're all righteous because you're in recovery? Wow. Boy, your alcoholism had a lot to say, didn't it? Her alcoholism showed surprising insight, didn't it? I asked her to switch back and to be in Victoria and respond. I don't want to take responsibility for anything if I'm really honest about how I feel. I don't want to deal with any of this. My denial of this pain is why I drank and why I still want to drink at times. She started to cry, but it was a different kind of a cry than before. It seemed to come from a wiser place inside of her consciousness. It seemed to come from it seemed to come from a wiser place inside of her consciousness. Her softened mood gave me the idea that she should have another conversation with Chad. I mentioned this to her and she agreed. I suggested that she speak to Chad about her alcoholism. She started out the dialogue by saying, I'm realizing that we are more alike than I care to admit. Do you see the moment that's happening here? What did she own? Her own irresponsibility. She faced something in herself that she didn't want to face, that she projected onto Chad. Oh, he had plenty of that. And yes, what Chad did was horrendous. It was terrible, unforgivable. But there was also a part of her that was capable of the same thing. I'm realizing that we are more alike than I cared to admit, than I ever cared to see. See, I became an alcoholic too, and I even drove drunk. I feel terrible about it. Why did you start to drink? She asked him. I asked her to switch and answer for Chad. She knew a lot about the answer to this. Chad said to her, I lost my wife from cancer. She knew this from the trial. She was the love of my life, Chad said. I will never forgive myself for what I did to you and your family that day. Victoria told me that this was something Chad actually said in a trial. I said, change again and be yourself. Is Victoria? She paused. I understand, she said. I've been there myself. We wrapped up the dialogue and then discussed the experience. Victoria said she felt something freed up inside of her. She went on to say, I'm just realizing that I had an unenforceable rule that said that this kind of thing wasn't supposed to happen to me and my family. I know it sounds crazy. Why should we be exempt from things like this? There's no denying it. We weren't. And it was foolish to think that we might be. I told Victoria that I thought that what was happening to her was positive, but I still thought that she was being a bit hard on herself. I said, you've forgiven Chad, but I said, but not yourself. We've got one more dialogue before you call it a night. I want you to talk to your alcoholic self again. Victoria now spoke to her alcoholic self and forgave it in the same way that she was forgiving Chad, with a deep compassion and empathy. Victoria realized that neither she nor her alcoholic self knew how to cope with this devastating experience, and that the unconscious, unenforceable rules that she had established made coping impossible. Through these conversations, Victoria was able to forgive herself and left the weekend alive and hopeful, eager to return to her husband and make amends to him. The building blocks of emotional sobriety make forgiveness possible. Our self-awareness helps us become aware of our unenforceable rule. Taking responsibility for ourselves prevents us from playing a blame game. If we do get lost in it for some time, we can stop blaming and start owning. We learn to surrender our expectations so we can deal with whatever challenges life sets before us. You see, it was impossible for her to forgive Chad if she had not forgiven herself. If she had not owned a part of herself that behaved in a very similar way to Chad and could have been sitting in the same chair Chad sitting in, she could have run into somebody when she was drinking and driving. What's that saying we hear in the rooms? There I go, but for the grace of God. And so when we start to really get down to it and get down to this level, we realize that being self-righteous and judging other people for what they do and for the harm they've caused us doesn't make a lot of sense. Because we can do that too. We've hurt people we've cared about and loved. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not encouraging us to bypass the anger and the rage and all the other things we need to do, like Victoria had to do. We need to give voice to all of those feelings to get to that place. You can't bypass that. She had to do all of that work to get to where she was that night. No, that what I read to you, what took about 20 minutes? That lasted about 3 hours, you guys. That was about a 3 hour session. Well, next week we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of forgiveness, but I thought I would begin the discussion of that by sharing with you that session with Victoria, which was so powerful. Let me invite Tom in and see if he's got any comments, and then if we have some time, you guys can share some of your reactions to what I read tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. One of the things which strikes me, and I've seen you do a lot of this work, is the capacity that people have to go through this work, right? One of the things which kept me, frozen, right? Like this example was, I didn't want to kind of open the door because I felt like it would just come spilling out. It would be out of control. I'd never stop crying, right? And so the decision to just, put a lid on it was made more sense to me. But never giving myself kind of credit that we're built with the capacity to handle this, right? And in a way, the natural process, I think, that we as humans are meant to is to work through it. It's unnatural to keep it bottled up in a way. So what watching people in this example, reading this and then seeing it so many times over and over again, the capacity that the human spirit has for going through this work and experiencing it and letting go and getting through the healing is really moving and inspiring in a lot of ways. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, that work there is just, it's amazing.
Yeah, you've witnessed some of it, haven't you, when you've come to some of my workshops and when I do that. And it's, it just to me, what is it so inspirational about this is that our capacity and our ability to deal with things is so much greater than any of us realize that we have. It's like we've lost faith in ourselves to deal with some of these things.
And
Anyways,
I will say you're skilled in bringing that out, but it is the person in the chair, right? And I've seen this on Zoom. Like I've seen you lead Zoom, examples of this. So it's not even like needing to be in the room or anything like that. It's just, it is the human spirit is really infinite in its capacity.
Is, and you know, look at that's, you know, this in 3-day intensive that's coming up at the end of October is like that on steroids, man, all weekend long. It's so powerful. There are 3 spots left in that if any of you are interested. So you let me know. You can send me an email or Tom and I can get you more information. But why don't we open it up, Tom, for a few shares before we have to wrap it up tonight?
I just wanted to give a quick update after last week. That was such a powerful meeting on the same subject. It opened up something really powerful for me, and the update is this. I have been sick with a lot of pain from shingles for 6 months. After the meeting, I started doing self-forgiveness work just by myself. And every single time something shitty came up in my head, I stopped and I said, you know what? I forgive you for that moment of perhaps lapsed judgment or whatever it was. I forgive you for not knowing what you didn't know later. I forgive you for putting yourself in a position where you could not protect yourself and you were unsafe. I forgive yourself for setting aside your own instincts to pull off risky behavior. Here's the update. My shingles is resolving. I have had less pain this week. And what started it was deep work into a specific trauma, but I hadn't finished the work. This is the work for me. And I thank you very much.
That's one thing that you really bring is a willingness to experiment and try it on, see what happens.
Well, I'm kind of liking this experiment. And it didn't even take a lot of writing. It was just a perked up ears for when I've set myself aside, as we talked about last week. So thank you so much. And thank you for your vulnerability tonight and reliving this.
I have more of a question. How would you have handled, the guy's name was Chad, right? What would you have done with Chad? Because I have a feeling most of us are Chad. How to forgive ourselves for some egregious thing.
Yeah. Well, I first, if I was working with Chad, it's an interesting question, like what would take place, right? So first of all, I'd probably have Chad talk to each person in the car directly, especially the little girl, and face her and deal with that, which would be heavy duty, right? Obviously for him to face her. Then it would follow the same thing. Then I'd have him confront himself, his alcoholism, part that was drinking and driving, and have him go into a dialogue like that. But first, I'd need him to go into fully experiencing and taking responsibility for what happened. And that's why I would have him start with probably the daughter that burned to death in the backseat, then the husband, maybe then the wife, and then to have a dialogue with himself. I might even, if it came up about his wife dying of cancer, have him talk to her as part of that experience. So there'd be a lot of different people coming in and out of that empty chair. I mean, there'd be a lot. There'd be a lot of flowing because it's all, you see what I mean? It was all a part of the experience. And this is what's really important. When we go back to deal with unfinished business, we need to examine every corner of that, every possibility. And that's why you will see me, you know, kind of floating across all of these different, you've seen it, you've been at some of my workshops when you've seen me do this with people, is that we try to go into every corner, especially those that are hidden and secret or that we've kept away from ourselves.